students, the topic of our discussion today is People and Languages till 650 AD. To assist me in my discussion is Ms. Preeta Bhattacharya from the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. So we begin our discussion now.
Rita Di, can you tell us something about the different categories of society that prevailed in early India?
For the sake of convenience, we divide the society in early India into 4 categories: that of hunters and gatherers, pastoralists, peasants and townsmen. Now, this is not to say that they were completely demarcated or segregated from one another. Okay. It is just to point out that in special environmental niches, these were the prominent categories. Now, there was considerable overlapping because you must be knowing that there were numerous changes throughout history. There were conquests and reconquests. So, these were just the prominent categories in particular areas.
Okay. Can you elaborate a little on the lifestyle of the hunter-gatherers?
Well, the hunter-gatherers lived by hunting animals for their food and other requirements and scavenging the forests for edible plants. Okay. The forests and shrublands were their resource bases. The prototype of this this community were the Shoboros, Pulindos and Nishadas, who have been mentioned in literature. You must be wondering how they have been described. Well, they have been described as dark complexion, stocky built people with bloodshot eyes and using strange languages. Now, in Banabhatta's Harshacharit, we find mention of some of these people, that is as late as the 7th century AD. Okay. But you must remember that by that time they have been acculturated and have been included. Their lifestyle is almost the same as the cultivators.
Okay. So you are saying there was an essential dichotomy between forest and settlement in early India.
Well, we see that in literature there are shifts in perceptions regarding forest lands. Okay. Now, initially they have been regarded as outside the civilized society, and they have not been given any importance. But then later on, when hermitages began to be established therein and sages began to show a preference for forest retreats, we find that in literature they have been romanticized. But then essentially between the state and these forest people, there was a feeling of hostility. Now, in the Arthashastra of Kautilya, we find that Kautilya advises the king to be aware of forest chiefs and mischiefs that they created, trouble that they created rather, and the tone of the text verges on hostility towards these people. By the mid-first millennium, we see that these forest dwellers are continuously being uprooted, then again they are being conquered, then displaced, because new states were emerging and coming into existence. So we see that there were continuous attempts to displace them and to capture their land, clear it and bring it under cultivation.
Rita Di, can you tell us something about the second category, the pastoralists?
They were nomads, their circuits varying in distances, means some travelled close by, some went a little further. Apart from this, they were also sometimes semi-sedentary, meaning they also practiced some amount of shifting cultivation. Another important role that they played was that they were parts of exchange networks, and this brought them into contact with the cultivators. So, you see they played a variety of roles in Indian society and economy.
Okay. So, and there are umpteen references to cattle raids in early Indian literature, especially in Vedic literature.
The most important reference here that I can point out is that, especially in the Rig Vedic period, is referred to as the Gopati. That is because his most important function was to carry on cattle raids. The wars that are referred to in Vedic literature are essentially cattle raids, and he was the leader of those raids. On the other hand, he is the chief of the people, but his title is Gopoti because he is lord of the cattle. That was his most important function.
Is there any reference to large scale incursions by pastoralists from outside?
Pastoral movements from outside India has been referred to throughout the history of early India. We find this is mainly due to disturbances in Central Asia. We find movements of people like the Hunas, the Kushans, the Shakos, the Parthians and the Pahallavas, and even the Indo-Aryans who were the first intruders into the Indian society. Now, the thing is that this was mainly influenced by movements from disturbances and from outside, but what we see is that once they came into India, they tried to assimilate themselves with the local culture, the local population. So much of our population was also influenced by these foreigners. Now, apart from movements from outside, we also have herds over here who played an important part in history. Like in South India, we have reference to cattle keepers. They were a special community, so it is not that because they were pastoralists, they did not have any part to play in the history of early India. One thing we must remember, that in the history of movements of people, the pastoralists played a very important part. They migrated from one area to another in search of grazing grounds, and these migrations played a very important part in the history of movements of the people.
Moving on to the third category, the peasants, what kind of social role do you think they played in early India?
Historians have highlighted the role played by peasants as providers of food and providers of revenue. Now, these peasants, compared to the other categories, were more sedentary and permanent, cultivating the land, and as such they were less autonomous than the other categories. In a sense, they could be pinned down to their location, and they were always given a very subordinate position in the social category. So, you see, their freedom was to some extent limited than the former categories that we have already discussed.
Okay, so was there any reference to peasant revolts?
Well, earlier on, the only kind of revolt that we find is in the form of migrations. When they were not contented with their lot, they just had no option but to move out from the place that they lived in. Now, later on, from about the second millennium AD, we find some events happening which have been interpreted by historians as forms of revolts. So, actually, those are also assumptions. We do not know if they were, in a sense, peasant revolts.
Okay. And how was peasant production related to the process of state formation?
The emergence of states and cities depended on the peasants. It is on the surplus that they produced. Their agricultural surplus went on to feed the people in the towns. So they need not have worried about the food supply and could just continue with their production and trade that they carried on. The people of the town were a non-producing, food-producing community, and they were assured of the food supply from these peasants.
Can you tell us something about the townspeople?
Towns emerged as administrative centers, as centers of manufacture and trade, and as well as pilgrimage centers. Naturally, we find various kinds of people like artisans and merchants, as well as other people engaged in other kinds of activities. Now, there were people who had close connections with the rural areas. So, we find people who had connection with the towns and the local areas. Now, in these towns, they carried on a lot of various kinds of activities, and later on, we also see them organized into guild-like organizations, like those of the manufacturers, then traders and all. Formerly, they were just occupational groups. Now, later on, as they numbers grew and there was an extension in the activities, we find that there were norms influencing their marriage circles and other kinds of social behavior. And gradually they also assumed, as we see later on, all the characteristics of a caste. So this crystallization of occupational groups also created a number of various kinds of castes which came to be designated by various names. And again, this heterogeneity of the urban centers differentiated them from villages. Social norms which were flexible in the towns, which were very rigid in the villages. And so the heterodox sects which preached their religion found an open space for their activities in these towns. Now later on, we find sophisticated Sanskrit culture was mainly city-based, and the people who lived there, the man about the town, also assumed great importance in the contemporary literature. Herein, we can refer to the Nagarakas, who are referred to in the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayan. We see their luxurious life that they led. They have the Ganikas to whose house they resorted to, went and had engaged in various pleasurable activities. So these kinds of activities in towns also speak of the wealth that was coming in from contemporary economic activities, mainly trade. So the life in the towns was mainly based on luxury and wealth, and this is a picture that we get of town life in the contemporary times.
Can you elaborate on the caste society that has been referred to in early Indian texts?
Well, in the caste society, we see that the notions of purity and pollution played an important role. In the hierarchical ordering of the Varna system, we find that the Brahman occupied the highest position since he was regarded as the purest among these people. Next, we have the Kshatriyas, or the warrior aristocracy, the Vaishyas, who was supposed to be engaged in cattle rearing, trade and agriculture. And last, at the bottom of the ladder, we find the Shudras, who was supposed to live on by serving the three higher Varnas. Outside this society, we find the existence of the untouchables. Now we find existence of other groups of people like the slaves. The slaves in India were not used for production purposes as they were in the European countries. They were mainly used for domestic purposes. And the various, we find that in literature we have various kinds of slaves have been referred to, like those who have been won during wars, those who have become slaves because of deaths and all this, various kinds of slaves, but not those engaged in production. There are also references to other kinds of lowly people, downgraded people, and they also include the ontojas. Ontojas are the people who live at the end of the society or at the very bottom of the social scale. The earliest literary tradition of India was memorized and orally transmitted. So the words Shruti and Smriti have often been used. You find them in early Indian literature. Now only at a later period we find that the language that was used in the Rig Veda was Sanskrit. Now it has been universally accepted that Sanskrit bears great affinity with almost all European languages except for Hungarian, Finnish, Turkish, Basque and etc. Now all these languages look back to a common ancestor, to a common dialect which was used by tribes inhabiting the steppe lands of South Russia. This affinity between all the Indo-European languages gave birth to the science of comparative philology. Now the kind of Sanskrit that was used in the Rig Veda was ornate and it was not understandable to the common people. At all stages, Sanskrit contained a lot of inflections And Vedic Sanskrit had various forms which were later simplified, and some of them later just went out of use.
Okay, and in the later period, certain changes can be noticed in the Sanskrit language.
The Sanskrit that was used in the Rig Veda, we find that the language developed considerably.
Yes.
Now, the older inflections often went out of use and the grammar was simplified, but then it was still difficult to understand. New words of non-Aryan origin came to be used, and new forms also emerged. But then what happened was that there were the older words that became obsolete and lost their original meanings were needed for what? So that the Vedas could be properly understood, and when the stotras were being uttered, they needed exact pronunciation. So to understand them properly, for the exact pronunciation, India developed a science of grammar and phonetics.
Can you give us the names of such texts?
Yes, the earliest linguistic texts which sought to maintain the purity of the Vedas was Yaksha's Nirukta, which was written sometime in the 4th century BC. Now, following this, we have a very important work, that of Panini's Ashtadhyayi, which was written about the end of the 4th century BC. Now, with Panini's grammar, we find that classical Sanskrit emerged and reached its zenith. We do not find any further development in this sphere except an expansion in its vocabulary. Panini's grammar is regarded as one of the most scientific and developed grammar before the 19th century. And what is more astonishing, that here we see that it contains as many as 4,000 grammatical rules. This was also very difficult for the layman to follow. So what was required is that a kind of pre-understanding or a commentary on Panini's Ashtadhyayi. So we find a further development, further works were composed, and these were mainly commentaries on his works. Amongst them we have Patanjali's Mahabhashya, and about 2nd century BC, and later on in 7th century AD we find Kashika Vritti, which was written by Jayaditta and Vamana. That was in the 7th century, much later, towards the end of the period that we are discussing. Now, with Panini, classical Sanskrit had reached its zenith, and it was at this time that the language came to be called Sanskrito, or refined, polished, as opposed to Prakrita, which means natural, and the language that was used by the common people.
Okay. And what about the royal dynasties? Were they using Sanskrit?
Yes, we see that formerly it was the language of the priestly class. Next, we find that the language came to be used by the royal dynasties in their panegyrics. We have the Shakos of Ujjain who use Sanskrit. Then again in Rudradaman's Ginnar inscription, we find the use of Sanskrit. And we have more minor some inscriptions where Sanskrit has been used.
Can you tell us something about the use of compound nouns?
Yes, we find that in Vedic and epic literature, compound nouns have been used, but they just contained 2 or 3 compound words. Now, in later times, in classical Sanskrit, we find the use of as many as 20 to 30 words in one noun. So it was a huge compound noun that was being used. But still we find that in, say for example, in Kalidas's literary works, he has tried to restrict them, make the words shorter. But in the Sanskrit panegyrics, like in the Allahabad Prashasti of Samudragupta, in the descriptions of the emperors, huge compound nouns have been used. And this, scholars say, have been influenced by the Dravidian languages. Now, together with this, we must mention another development was the use of long sentences.
Okay.
Now in Bhashya and Bano and Shubandhu's works about the 7th century AD, we find use of sentences as long as covering 2 or 3 lines in print. And see, this is the thing that gradually made Sanskrit ununderstandable to the common people.
Rita Di, you were talking about Sanskrit, which was essentially a literary language. Can you tell us something about the language of the masses?
The everyday languages of the people have been preserved by the unorthodox sects who wrote their literature in the language very close to the common people. Now we find that in the pre-Guptan times, especially we may notice the inscriptions of Ashok, they were all written in a kind of formalized Prakrit, because it was understandable to the common people. Now in Sanskrit drama, it is also noticeable that the women and the more lowly, humbler folk, they are made to speak in Prakrit. Now at a later time, Prakrit developed various forms, and it was used by various categories of people, and it was much influenced by the local dialects.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit more about the different forms of Prakrit?
The earliest and well-known form of Prakrit is Pali, which was adopted by the Sthaviravadin Buddhists in their literature. Now the Buddha preached his disciples in Pali, but it was a different kind of Pali. It's called Magadhi. And it was much as his doctrine spread all over India, it was influenced by the local dialects, as I have already mentioned. Pali is still the religious language of especially Buddhists in Ceylon, Burma and Southeast Asia. Now we can go on to the other kinds of Prakrit, but let me elaborate on the Magadhi used in the Mauryan courts. We noticed that that was the main official language in Magad, among the official circles. Now another kind of hybrid kind of Magadhi called the Adha Magadhi was used by the Jainas. It was one of their sacred languages, and they composed much of their literature in that language. Now variants of Prakrit is also to be seen in the language called Shaurasheni, which has been used in the western part of modern UP, and Maharashtri, which is used in northwestern Deccan. You may notice that Shaurasheni was used by women and respectable people of the lower order in Sanskrit drama. And the other language was a literary language which was used for songs, lyrical songs. So apart from this, there were other minor variants of the Prakrit language. But by the times of the Guptas, the Prakrit language was formalized and standardized, and it lost much of the local influence that it has accumulated.
Okay. What about the upper branches? They were further later developments.
A further development of the Indo-European languages was the upper brancha. Now, this was language which was used mainly in Western India, and it means a falling away, means a degenerate kind of languages. Now, a kind of upper brancha was also used in Bengal, and maybe it was regarded by scholars as the ancestor of modern Bengali.
Okay. And can you tell us something about the South Indian languages?
In South India, the 4 main languages that were used was Tamil, Telugu, Canarese and Malayalam. Now, literature, scripts and languages used in these versions had a good antiquity. It went back to about the 4th century AD, and we find that literature has been composed from that time in these various kinds of languages. They have used Sanskrit loan words, sometimes have influenced Sanskrit, and it was also the other way around. Now, we have talked about the main languages that were used in northern and southern India. we may now include something about the scripts that were used in writing these particular languages. Now, the earliest script that is noticeable in India is to be found on the Harappan seals.
Yes.
But sadly, they have remained undeciphered, so we do not know what they are trying to convey to us. But if you remember, we say that we have found a tablet in Dholabira which seems to be a kind of a notice board announcing something official proclamation is being made. But now sadly, I've told you that unfortunately nothing has been deciphered, so we can only assume, we can only just make a tentative decision, take a tentative decision in this regard. But later on, when people became familiar with writing, we find the first that is important script that we notice is on Ashokan inscriptions. And there are two kinds of scripts. There are, the earliest is Brahmi, that is written from left to right. Now scholars are also puzzled as to from where this script has come from. Some say that it is a later development of the Harappan script, but others don't agree with this, and they suggest a more indigenous or more another kind of origin to this script. Next we have the Kharoshti that he has used. The Kharoshti is definitely influenced by the Aramaic scripts of Persia, and it is written from right to left. So these are the few important scripts that have been used in early India.